Всем привет, люди! Это Эрик, и сегодня поговорим об Zaporozhian Sich, ну также волнасти войска Запорожского низового. Hello everybody, it's Eric, and today we're going to be talking about the Zaporozhian Sich, or as it was also known, the free lands of Zaporozhian host the Lower. So, today we'll be keeping the video a little bit shorter and condensed on the topic of what was the Sich, some straightforward facts and timelines, and I'll do a deep dive into its everyday operations, its role in Kozachitva, Cossack life, and its historical significance in another video. Alrighty, so let's get started. The Zaporozhian Sich was the city-fortress capital of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, a semi-autonomous polity and Cossack proto-state established in the 16th century and lasting until the 18th century when it was burned down by Catherine. As I made mention in my video on the Treaty of Pereyaslav, I want to not refer to her as the Great. Now, the name Zaporozhia itself refers to the military and political organization of the Cossacks and the location of their autonomous territory, as it means beyond the rapids of the Dnieper River. The Dnieper Rapids were a major portage on the north-south Dnieper trade route. The term Sich is an East Slavic verb meaning to cut or chop, and likely referred to the usual wood sharp-spiked stockades that were built around Cossack settlements. As we can see from the various visual representations on screen, the Sich was an elevated wooden fortress with access to the river, equipped with defensive positions, cannonades, and all manner of workshops, training grounds, stables, boatyards, sleeping quarters, a church, and a large central square which was used for the Rada, or council. That's the Sich itself. Now, let's talk about its history. There are 6 time periods to keep in mind that involves the Zaporozhian Sich. Now, the first one being the emergence of the Sich, mainly the construction of Khortytsia Castle, 1471 to 1583. Now this, as you know, is the earliest Cossack history and origins from that video. Now, the second one is its time as part of the lesser Polish province of the Polish crown by inclusion into the Kiev Voivodeship 1583 to 1657. The third point, the struggle against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ottoman Empire, and the Crimean Khanate for the independence of Casa Kadmanite, 1657 to 1686. Fourth point, the struggle with Crimea, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire for the unique identity of the Cossacks, 1686 to 1709. Fifth point to remember is the standoff with Imperial Russia during its attempts to cancel the self-governing of the Sich and its eventual fall, 1734 to 1775. And finally, the formation of the Danubian Sich outside of the Russian Empire and finding ways to return home, 1775 to 1828. This is also where my family history is intrinsically wrapped up into as well. So, let's start with the emergence of the Sich. Remember back to my video discussing the origins of the Cossacks, in particular the Ukrainian Zaporozhian Cossacks. They were brave settlers who took the crazy risk on orders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to settle the dangerous borderland, Ukraina. The Sich itself emerged as one of those defensive settlements established in the middle of this no-man's land, as a method of defense by the Slavic colonists. It helped to defend against the frequent and devastating raids conducted by the Crimean Tartars, who captured and enslaved hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Poles in operations they called Harvesting the Steppe. And they were all kept in Crimea and mainly sold to the Ottoman Empire, again in that place known as Kaffa, as I've mentioned before. Now, the Ruthenian settlers created a self-defense force, fierce enough to combat the Tartar hordes, the Kozaks. Now, these Kozaks built a series of small fortified camps that were later united to form a central fortress that would later become the Zaporozhian Sich. Now, Prince Dmytro Vishnevsky established the first Zaporozhian Sich on the island of Khortytsia, also a great vodka, I must say, in 1552. This Sich would be attacked and burned down and moved either north or south along the Dnieper on multiple occasions throughout history until its final destruction in 1775. Moving on to our second timeline point, the Zaporozhian Cossacks and the Sich became included in the Kiev voivodeship of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from 1583 to 1657. As you'll remember from my Cossacks Origins video covering the registered Cossacks section, the Cossacks resented the Polish rule, the privileges of Polish nobility, and the growing restrictions on registered Cossacks, economic factors, and also the difference of faith between Polish Catholicism and Ukrainian Orthodox Christianity. Eventually, all came to a head, as we know, in 1648 when Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky incited the Cossacks and Ruthenians into full-blown rebellion. At this point in time, we see the Sich become a central point in Cossack life, governed by the Sich Rada and built upon the principles of Kazachitstva. More on all of this again in a later video. Now, let's move on to the third and fourth talking points that I've mentioned, the Cossack Hetmanate. As a result of the rebellion, the Cossack Hetmanate was established with the Treaty of Pereyaslav. Now remember that video. Please go check it out if you haven't. It's huge for just history in general. Now, the Zaporozhian host was split into the Hetmanate with its capital at Cherhin and the more autonomous region of Zaporozhia, which continued to be centered on the Sich. During this period, the Sich would change locations several times again, most notably after the infamous Battle of Poltava in 1709. The Kortolnik Sich was destroyed, and Baturin, the capital of famous Hetman Ivan Mazepa, was razed. Another one was built in 1711, but swiftly destroyed by the Imperial Russian government, and the Cossacks were forced to flee into the Crimean Khanate to avoid persecution and built the Olieski Sich, which is still in modern-day Olieski. Now, to the fifth point. Fear of the independence of the Sich resulted in the Russian administration that abolished the Hetmanate in 1764. The Cossack officer class was incorporated into the Imperial Russian hereditary nobility, the dvoryanstvo. Rank-and-file Cossacks, however, were reduced to mere peasants and serfs. Tensions further rose after the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarka, when the need for a southern frontier ended after the annexation of Crimea. The colonization of Novorossiya, New Russia, with Serbian and Romanians sponsored by Russian government created even further ethnic conflicts. After the end of the war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire for possession of the Black Sea and Crimean steppes and peninsula, Russia no longer had a need for Zaporozhian Cossack protection. Russia finally destroyed the Zaporozhian Sich through military force in 1775 by the direct order of Catherine That brings us to our final talking point, the destruction and aftermath. So let's get the grim part over with. Russian General Peter Tekeli received orders to occupy and destroy the Zaporozhian Sich from Grigory Potemkin, who himself had just been formally admitted into Cossackdom a few years earlier. Potemkin was given direct orders from Catherine to provide his new loyalty to prove his new loyalty to the empire. On the 5th of June, 1775, Tekeli surrounded the Sich with artillery and infantry. He postponed the assault and allowed visits while the head of the host, Petro Kalnyshevsky, decided how to handle the ultimatum. The Zaporozhians surrendered peacefully and were allowed to exit, after which the structure was razed and burned to ash. As I made mention, it was then that some of the Cossack officer class were granted noble status, while the rest were made into peasants and serfs. These surviving Cossacks attempted unsuccessfully to make plans to move the Sich to North America or Australia. Instead, under the guidance of Starshinya named Liak, a conspiracy was formed to allow 50 officers to obtain Ottoman passports for a fishing trip in the Danube Delta within the Ottoman Empire. Once the passports were obtained, some 5,000 Zaporozhian Cossacks were able to file across the border, passing back their passports some 100 times. Once through, these Cossacks established the new Danubian Sich as a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire. Other surviving Zaporozhians would later answer the call in 1718 to fight for General Potemkin, fought bravely in the Russo-Turkish War of 1787 to 1792, which instead of winning them the right to settle in southern Ukraine as they had proclaimed when asked, they were forced to relocate on the Kuban River in Krasnodar Krai within modern-day Russian Caucasus mountain range. In 1860, these Cossacks changed their name to Kuban Cossacks and joined the Russian League of Cossack Hosts. Historian Olena Apanovich notes that the abolition of the Zaporozhian Sich had a strong symbolic effect, and memories of the event remained for a long time in local folklore. I also agree with this statement and would add it has remained burned into the memories of those who were oppressed, betrayed, and forced to serve or run. And one day, I hope we get our peace and justice. Thank you everyone for watching. Please check out my Patreon, and thank you to everyone who has already donated. We are so close to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube as well, so please spread the word about this project to anyone who you think might be interested. Kozackomu rodu nie ma perewodu. Sily I chestwa paka. The Cossack officer class was incorporated into the Imperial Russian hereditary nobility. Nobility. All right.